Hello, my name is Tyler Peterson, and welcome to the defense portion of my capstone portfolio as part of my master's program through ASU Online. This presentation will cover my research paper on American reactions to the attacks on Washington and Baltimore during the War of 1812. Now, my reasons for choosing this topic are similar to why I wanted to do graduate research in the first place. I wanted to learn more about American armed conflicts and the men and women who had to live through them. And of all the wars the U.S. has been involved in, the War of 1812 was really the one that hadn't been covered in my undergraduate research with any great detail. And that always seemed puzzling to me. This was the first time we went to war as a sovereign nation, the first time we issued a formal declaration of war from Congress, and the first time, and still one of the only times, that we've been invaded by a foreign power. The things that I remember today are mostly elements of early patriotism, the birth of the national anthem, the victory at Baltimore and New Orleans. Those moments, generally speaking, are the ones that have remained in our culture, the positive and patriotic ones. So I wanted to learn more about what Americans of their time thought of the war in their country, particularly in 1814 during the battles of Washington and Baltimore. I wanted their firsthand accounts so I can understand them as individuals and how they saw themselves as a country. I wanted to know what they understood the war to be and what they saw as significant. And in my research, I determined that American reactions to these two events lacked any kind of national cohesion that we might associate today in times of war. This highlights the fragility of a young America, as not only was the country divided politically to go to war in the first place, but a number of anecdotes, diaries, letters, personal documents from Americans show that some in the country even were indifferent or actively working against the United States. So although the war resulted in a surge of nationalism, one which is still very much part of our country, the War of 1812 is not recognized in a way that Americans of 1814 would have recognized it, as a conflict exposing the fractures of a nascent republic. Long before any battles took place in the war, America already had problems of division. Political divisions were the most obvious to citizens. The vote even to go to war in the first place was extremely partisan, with every single Federalist member of Congress voting against the war, while over 80% of the majority Democratic Republicans, or just Republicans as they would say, voted for the war. Now, this was more than just a policy vote. This was a personal vote to many. The Republicans, led by James Madison, saw this as a sort of second war for independence, while Federalists really mocked it as a power-hungry land grab by Republicans for Canadian annexation and gave it the name Mr. Madison's War. And while it might seem normal to have a certain amount of division between sides, one would almost expect to see Federalists rally to the country's side once the country is embroiled in battle. But as we will see, that won't happen, and in fact, some will take it so far that they will use their country's destruction as a way to further their own ideologies. Let's look at the focus of my sources now. This map is the Chesapeake Campaign of the British in 1814, representing really what was their last great offensive of the war, and this is the period in question. The attack on Washington occurred in late August, shown here. This had some build-up to it as British troops had to be landed. They marched over the course of a number of days to get to Washington. They won the battle outside the city at Bladensburg and invaded the capital unopposed. Then, at the start of September, the British attacked Baltimore, shown here. This was much quicker. The ships pulled into the outer harbor to Fort McHenry, and the battle lasted only a full day, just 25 hours, before the British ended their bombardment and sailed away. But of these two events, the most egregious examples I found of indifferent or anti-American actions came from the citizens of Washington, surprisingly. So let's take a look at that. In my research, when I'm talking about the British, I'm really mostly talking about these two men. That's Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross in command of the Navy and the Army forces. Now, leading up to these attacks, these men really created a notorious reputation for themselves among Americans, especially Cockburn. He was responsible for a number of raids along the coastal towns of Maryland, so he really was public enemy number one in the minds of these citizens in Washington and Baltimore. Now, that's really important to remember. In the days leading up to the burning of the Capitol, many Washington residents were unsure if they could stop these men from conquering them. Mary Hunter, a chaplain's wife in Washington, wrote to her sister lamenting that, quote, "Our fears and troubles for some time past have been almost beyond description. The British Army, commanded by General Ross, and the seamen by Admiral Cockburn, had been advancing upon us for more than 2 weeks, and as we supposed, were not likely to be stopped or prevented from ravaging our city and destroying our property to the extent of their wishes," unquote. And she was right. That's exactly what the British did. Washington residents watched as their forces ran from the Battle of Bladensburg and abandoned the city behind them. Now, at this point, we have an invading foreign military force about to take the nation's capital. Cockburn and Ross's orders are to burn the public buildings, but to leave private property alone, as long as citizens did not put up resistance. Now, this is where things take a surprising turn. There were a number of Washington residents who were disarmed by the fact the British soldiers were acting with such class, as it was, while the city was being sacked. One Washington socialite, Margaret Bayard Smith, wrote about Cockburn and how his manners were, quote, "that of a common sailor, not of a dignified commander. He, however, deserves praise and commendation for his own good conduct and the discipline of his sailors. I must praise his moderation. Indeed, his conduct was one such as to disarm the prejudices that existed," unquote. Bayard here is excusing the invading force because they are being gentlemanly. And by what she's saying, not only does it excuse the attack on Washington, but all the attacks that got him the reputation that was described by Mary Hunter. And what did Hunter think about her attack? In her case, she had soldiers enter her home and occupy it, and they made her get provisions for their men. And this is what she writes, quote, "Seeing us alarmed, they said everything that could be said to quiet us. I told them I had seen many British officers who were gentlemen, and that I could not bring myself to be afraid. They mentioned that it was a painful service to them, that they were disposed to do all in their power to mitigate the distress of the citizens against whom they had no enmity, that their war was with the government and not with the people. All this relieved our fears concerning the city and ourselves," unquote. That's certainly a remarkable description for a woman who we heard from saying that her fears were beyond description in the days leading up to the attack. But let's look at politics now. How did Federalists act to this? What did they think of this? We established earlier that they opposed the war, but did they unite in national spirit to oppose the destruction of an American major city? The answer is no. Again, we're going to hear from Margaret Bayard Smith, who had an encounter with a doctor who happened to be Federalist on the streets of Washington the day after the city had been burned. She recounts the exchange they had. She said he, quote, "exulted in the defeat of our army and the capture of our city." He said to her, "Did I not tell this? I suppose, Mrs. Smith, your wise men will now believe a standing army a necessary thing and a navy in the bargain," unquote. Now let's just pause to think about what this means. These are citizens who are putting their personal ideologies or individual honor above that of their country. And these aren't just the attitudes of citizens who are removed from the horror of the situation, maybe let's say in another state on the outskirts of an American territory. These are the emotions and the reactions of citizens of the capital who just watched their city burn down. How is it that people can be so easily persuaded to see past the devastation of their city? Well, in part, America had not yet established a sense of national pride or an image of their national character. We still have people who are acting on their best interest. In Mary Hunter's case, we're talking about the quartering of soldiers. They came in and made her serve them food. Now, that's an offense the British committed in the Revolutionary War as well. And that's something the citizens fought back against, but in this case, she brushes it off. These are reactions from American citizens to the destruction of their country. Now, obviously, they are not representative of the whole. Surely they can't be. But they do represent the divisions that were present in American society during this war. Altogether, I'm very proud of the work I've produced here. There were some limitations, however, to my work. For example, I relied heavily on personal letters and diaries, and there just aren't a ton of digital copies available. Most of what survives to today are in collections or libraries, and it was really impossible to have access to them during the pandemic because these places were not taking personal visits or requests for copies. But if I had gotten my hands on some of those documents, I definitely would have incorporated more of those sources to build on this research. I was able to find more sources from Washington than Baltimore online, so I would have liked to have heard more voices from Baltimore. I also would have liked to have been incorporated more newspapers. I would have liked to have seen how papers from Federalist New England states compared to those in sort of the Mid-Atlantic Republican region, and how both of them would have put the war in context for their readers. I want to thank you for watching this presentation, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.